Okay, hello class. Okay, this is your first substantive um, lecture, and it's on chapter 1 of Introduction to Logic, the book that I'd like you to purchase for this class by Irvin Kopy. Okay, so chapter 1 is all about basic logical concepts, and the first thing you need to put in your memory, and if you say it 3 times to yourself or think about it 3 times. Actually say it out in your mind 3 times and try to memorize it, okay? This definition of logic, I'd like you to memorize. It goes all the way back to the great founder of logic, Aristotle, who was a great student of Plato. And Plato used logical reasoning, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, even before Plato and Socrates, they used logical reasoning, but they never really thematized logic and made it into a discipline and extracted from that the laws of thinking. So Aristotle came up with a definition of logic, and Kopy sort of tweaked it a little bit, made it modern, and it's a very solid definition. So I'd like you to memorize that. Logic is the study of the principles and methods used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning, okay? Logic is the study of the principles and methods used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. And that's a good working definition. So that's 1.1 of logic of your book. And I just want you to memorize that. Think about that. Well, think about what these words mean also. I mean, don't just repeat it like a parrot, you know. So a principle comes from principi, means the beginnings of something. So the principle is the foundation of something, okay? And you know what a method is, how to do something. So it's the study of the foundations and the methods used to distinguish whether or not what you hear is a valid or invalid argument, or if it's strong or a weak argument, or if it's an argument at all, okay? It's the study of the principles and methods used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. But think about what that means. It means you're making a judgment about other people's arguments. That's what logic is all about. And like I said, in this class, I want to take it another step, an important step. Take these and transform them into tools to construct arguments. But logicians are not interested in constructing arguments. They're interested in teaching people how to evaluate arguments. You need to know what a proposition is, okay? So a proposition is a particular kind of statement. It's a declarative statement. Like, you know, there's my diploma from Penn State University, which I put there deliberately, you know, for these lectures. So that immediately behind me is is my diploma from Penn State University. That's a proposition. It's a declarative statement. It gives information, okay? It's a declarative statement. It's not an exclamation like, wow, look at that. He got a PhD from Penn State. You know, it's not wow, it's not look how beautiful the frame is. It's not that. So it's not a description, it's not an explanation, it's a declarative statement, and that's called a proposition. Now, propositions are either true or false in logic, okay? And so either it's false that that's my diploma, or it's true. Okay, so propositions are true or false, but arguments are not true or false. Now, what is an argument? An argument is a conclusion, which is a proposition that makes a claim. And that proposition that makes a claim is called the conclusion. And if it's an argument, then it has support. And the support are called premises, if there's more than one. If there's one, it's called a premise. So together, the premises and the conclusion, that's called an argument. And sometimes two premises work together to support a conclusion. Sometimes the premises work independently to support a conclusion. Sometimes a conclusion becomes a premise for another argument. and it makes a structure. But for now, you just need to know that an argument is not the same as a proposition. A proposition is simply a declarative statement, and the statement is either true or false in logic. And an argument is a proposition that takes the form of a conclusion, which is a claim being made. I claim, like, that's my diploma. So I'm making a claim, and then the support. Well, I could offer support that they're the signatures of the dean of this university, and the, and so on and so forth. That's whatever I use to support my claim. That's called the premise or premises, if there's more than one. So you need to know what a proposition is, what logic is. And Copy has done a nice little thing. This makes learning enjoyable. I always like to share people, the word school comes from scholia in Latin, which means leisure. So, and I had a very positive experience in my 13 years in college. It was very leisurely, actually. To be able to study logic, that's a leisurely thing. People are working, to make ends meet and put food on the table. They don't really have time, to leisurely study logic. So the very word school is connected to leisure. So to make it more enjoyable, more leisurely, and actually to educate yourself a little bit more, Copy has given you the names of people. He's done like a little biographical sketch that connects with what he's talking about. And if you read those, it makes it much more enjoyable and leisurely. Like knowing who Aristotle is, for example. I mean, that's not the whole biography of Aristotle, but he writes down some very important things about important people. And if you take the time to read those and think about it in a kind of leisurely fashion, then as time goes by, you become an educated person. So I would read those just to, you need to know what an inference is. Logicians think about inferences. So you've heard, well, what do you infer from that? And what an inference is the process by which a proposition is arrived at and affirmed on the basis of some other proposition or set of propositions. I think of the inference as the kind of movement from the premise to the conclusion. Like if these are all my premises, then I infer, boom, this conclusion. So it's the process itself. It's more of a verb. An inference is a verb rather than a noun. Think of it as the very activity of moving from the premises to the conclusion. Now, sometimes passages look like arguments, but they're not. There's explanations. And sometimes somebody's just trying to explain something. They're not trying to create an argument. And those look like arguments. So you have to be a little more discerning. The way I made that clear to myself is if the person is trying to claim something, get you to believe certain way, then it's an argument. If they're just describing how something came to be, or if they're explaining how something came to be, they're not trying to get you to accept anything. They're just trying to, like in biology and botany, what is photosynthesis? Nobody's trying to get you to accept the fact that there is photosynthesis. They're just trying to describe this process by which plants take in light and water and nourishment and transform it into their own energy and so on. Okay, so I told you in my orientation that you should at least work 3 examples from the exercises. So he's got usually an example with the right answer. So go over those. And what's nice about Copy, and what's true about logic in general, is that it pertains to any discipline or any sphere of human activity. So it can come from politics, it can come from religion, it can come from anywhere. The things that we're talking about in logic apply to any discipline or any sphere of human activity. So he draws from politics, he draws from religion, he draws from science and everything. Now, sometimes it's hard to recognize the argument because it's embedded in ordinary language, or not what they call natural language. And there's little ways that you learn how to find how to identify what is the premise and what is the conclusion. The way this all fits in is you have to, in order to evaluate arguments, which is the whole first part of our course, you have to be able to perceive it in the first place. Have you ever watched people talking? Sometimes they're disagreeing with each other and they don't even hear each other, what they're saying. And one might say, but that's not what I said. It's not what I said. So they're not even talking to one another because they don't understand what the other person is saying. They don't know what is the conclusion, what is the premise. So the only way, the first step to being able to evaluate an argument is to be able to perceive it. So you need to see what is the conclusion and what are the premises. Then you can evaluate it to see, well, do these premises really support the conclusion? And so logicians have come up with little helpful tools for recognizing premises and recognizing conclusions. But these are not hard and fast rules. They're just helpful methods. If you see the word therefore, or hence, or so it follows that, or consequently, or this proves that, or for the reason that, or thus, for these reasons it follows. I'm reading from page 11 on the book, and from the book, which entails that, which implies that, from which we can infer. If you hear someone say, especially the word therefore, if you see that, then probably what comes after that is the conclusion, okay? But not all the time. Like if you see the word so, a lot of times that may mean what comes after that is the conclusion. But it need not mean that. It depends on the context. See, all meaning takes on meaning from a context. That's important, actually. That's one of those things. It's related to what I'm talking about now, but it's sort of more important than anything in chapter 1. Language takes on meaning in a context. So if you want to understand what something means, you have to reconstruct the context. It always matters who said it and in what context and what their intentions are. That's a very important thing to remember in the thinking process. So if I hear the word so, it doesn't mean that every time I hear the word so, what follows from that is a conclusion. I could be just saying, so what I'm saying is that, you know, or it could mean I'm just summarizing what I had just said. But these are called conclusion indicators. They're words or phrases like therefore or thus, and they appear in an argument, and they usually, but not always, they indicate that what follows is a conclusion. And there are also premise indicators too. And so they function like conclusion indicators, only they indicate that probably, but not always, what's happening is the person is providing support or good reasons or some proof, some evidence. If you see the word since, but not always, because the word since can mean chronologically, it can mean ever since time immemorial, humans have built institutions, let's say. So now that word since is not being used as a premise indicator. It's just being used chronologically, like in terms of time. But if you see the word because, the cause of the being of something, or for, but not always. For is just a preposition. It could mean, you know, fourscore and 7 years. It doesn't have to mean, you know, that. So it depends on the context. You have to think. You know, you can't just act. You can't just respond like an automaton. But a premise indicator then is a word or phrase like because or since that normally signals that what follows is a premise, is a support for the conclusion. So that's the first thing you want to do when you're making, trying to evaluate an argument. You want to find out what the person is claiming first. That's the first thing to do. Go look for the conclusion. And usually if the person is passionate about something, or even if they're not passionate, it becomes quite clear, especially if they speak clearly. If they're just rambling and saying whatever comes in their mind, like some people do, then it's pretty hard to find what they're concluding. You know, they just talk and it's blah, blah, blah. And they're just trying to get you to feel a certain way and so on. But if somebody's trying to be clear and make an argument, then it's usually pretty obvious what they're concluding. So I always look for the conclusion first and then look for the support. Now there's what, I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, rhetorical question. There's this wonderful, great tradition that I'm a student of. It's called the History of Classical Rhetoric. And if we had time, I would help you to take these arguments that you're going to construct in the second part of our course for your final presentations and to turn them into eloquent speeches. So you can learn to speak like Eleanor Roosevelt or Martin Luther King Jr. or some of the great speakers that we've had, Pericles from ancient Greece. Well, I mean, these are some of the best speakers, but rhetoric is the art of persuasive speech and how to speak in such a way that it becomes eloquent. In fact, another name for rhetoric is eloquence. But that's not what a rhetorical question is. A rhetorical question is taken from that tradition of classical rhetoric, but it's just a little device used by speakers. And if it's used discriminately and tastefully, it can be very powerful. So instead of like making a claim, which sometimes turns people off because you're coming right at them, like in their face with some claim. And a lot of times people will just react to that and they'll just think just the opposite, because it's a natural reaction. It's like if you pull on a leash of a dog, they'll pull the other way. So you're actually training the dog to pull. So rather than coming at somebody really forcefully and putting it in their face, you can simply ask, after you've supported some conclusion and made it very strong, then you just back off and just ask a question. So your question is a kind of submission, but really it's not a question if you think about it in the context. You're making a claim, but the claim is being made in the form of a question. So a rhetorical question is, it's not really a question. It's a conclusion that takes the form of a question. And it could be, if it's used, like I said, tastefully and discriminately. If you do it all too much, and then it becomes just turn off. It becomes like somebody just, it turns people off. So everything is about good taste. So those are called rhetorical questions. Now, there's another thing that's quite effective in argumentation, or even evaluating arguments, and whether you're constructing it or making judgments about arguments. And that's called the enthymeme. That's on page 16 and 17. An enthymeme is an unstated proposition. So sometimes the premises or the conclusion are not stated. So sometimes people will just, and lawyers will do this, good lawyers will do this, for example. They'll just support their conclusion and they'll build all this evidence and then they'll just back off. And what happens is the jury or whomever the person is speaking to will make that inference in their heads already. They think they came up with it, but really the speaker has done it. And this is not really being deceptive or anything. It's just a way of making your claim in an artful way. In fact, one of the great orators and theoreticians of classical rhetoric, his name was Demosthenes. Demosthenes, there it is, from ancient Greece. He said the audience applauds always more loudly when it's an enthymeme. So an enthymeme is an argument that's stated incompletely, the unstated part being taken for granted. But that can be very effective. And you might want to experiment with that when we do our final presentations. You can let the conclusion be implied and unstated. It's there, if you reconstruct the context, it's there, but it's there in a kind of unstated way. That's called an enthymeme. So chapter 1 is an easy chapter, but I want you to take it seriously too, um, because these are concepts that you need to be very clear about. So take the time to read Copley. There go my dogs. Somebody's going by that they don't like. Oh boy. All right, so I'm almost done anyhow, so I don't think they're going to bark for too long. Sorry. I have 2 dogs. You know, I do dog training, dog agility, and everything. So, all right. So the other thing in chapter 1 that's important is my one dog doesn't bark; he howls. Oh, sorry about this. It's the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. Okay. So this is important. So read from chapters 24, or page 24, 25, 26, and 27. You need to know the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. And I know a lot of people have their own ways of distinguishing this, but in logic, here's the way they distinguish that in logic. With deductive arguments, that's what we're going to focus on in this course. There's inductive also, which is important. Science moves inductively for the most part, although they use, so with deductive arguments, the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. Okay? The conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. So if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. That's really the most beautiful thing about deductive reasoning. That's why I'm focusing on that, because it's so powerful. If you can get someone to accept the truth of your premises, then they have to accept it. Oh, this is important. If it's valid, this is the main thing about this whole chapter, about validity. Well, I need to talk about that with you. You can read Copley too. If the argument is valid, then the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. Okay? And valid arguments are only deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are not valid or invalid. They're either highly probable or less probable. But with deductive arguments, if the argument is valid, and we need to talk about validity, then the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. That means if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true also. So that makes it a very powerful way of arguing. That's why logicians I didn't think they would explode into barking. They usually don't bark like this. There's somebody just hanging out in front. Sorry about this. I think you can still hear me though. So with deductive arguments that are valid, the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. Okay. With inductive arguments, we have either highly probable or less probable. So I don't know if you've studied, like if you're in social science, I didn't think they would carry on like this for so long. In the sciences, they go inductively mostly. So if something is significant, that means if you did the experiment 95 times or 100 times, 95 times it would come out the same way. So that's probability. Or if it's even more significant, that means if you did the experiment 100 times, 99 times out of 100, it would come out the same way. So that's called valid. Well, it's not validity in logic, but it's called valid in the sciences. By the way, that reminds me, this is another important thing. Remember I said earlier that language takes on meaning in context? Well, the same words take on different meanings in different disciplines. That, if you're clear about that, then that clarifies your mind a lot, because you can get confused real quick. Like, for example, in the word valid, for example, in logic, validity pertains only to deductive arguments. But I know from my background, my undergraduate degree was in psychology, and I took a lot of statistics and so on, and I learned about the psychological experiment. I thought I wanted to be, an experimental psychologist. So I took all this experimental design, and I learned how science works. So that was good. But in the social sciences, for example, validity means something else. It means something is significant enough to publish your data as significant difference between between the experimental group and the non-experimental group, dependent and independent variables. Or, for example, the word compliment. In normal parlance, the word compliment means you say something nice about somebody. Like, that was a brilliant essay that you wrote or something. The word compliment in logic, it's the same word. It means something completely different. It means putting the word non, N-O-N, not, N-O-N, not N-O-T. If you put the word non on front of something, then that's the complement of that thing. We'll talk about that later when we could come to that. But you can see the words mean completely different things depending on the discipline or the context. So you need to know deductive and inductive arguments. And the last thing he talks about that's important in chapter 1 is the difference between validity and truth. But they usually don't, my dogs usually don't bark for this long. Somebody's hanging out in front of my house. But I think you can still hear me. If this is inaudible, I'll do the whole thing again, but I don't want to stop the video. All right, so validity means that the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. So if I say, for example, all human beings are mortal, that Socrates is a human being. If you accept the truth of those two premises, that all human beings are mortal, that Socrates is a human being or was a human being, then Socrates was mortal. That follows with absolute necessity. So the thing about valid arguments is that the conclusion is already there in the premises, but it hasn't been drawn out. And that's the very word deduction. Deduction, the very word deduction comes from, D means from, and ducere means to draw forth. So when you're doing deductive reasoning, you're drawing forth a new truth from two other truths. So the conclusion is already there in the premises. It's just not seeing how they're connected. So the deductive argument is drawing forth a new truth from already existing truths. And so for forensic medicine, for example, or when they come to analyze a crime scene and they just get a hair or DNA and all that stuff, they can make all kinds of inferences from this, all based on deductive reasoning. They can take one thing, they can take a hair from, and they know if it's a man, how old he was, if it's a woman, how old she was, they can know all kinds of things just from the smallest little thing. The best example is from DNA, which is, you can learn so much about who somebody was, make identifying judgments based on DNA. So not just that, but in so many spheres, you can use deductive arguments to draw forth a new truth from pre-existing truths. But it's really not new. You're just drawing something there forth that's implicit. You're taking something implicit, making it explicit. So that's my understanding of a deductive argument. Copy describes it this way. A deductive argument is one of the two major types of arguments traditionally distinguished, the other being inductive argument. A deductive argument claims to provide conclusive grounds for its conclusion. If it does provide such grounds, it is valid. If it does not, it's invalid. So that's the most important thing from chapter 1 to understand about validity. If the premises provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion. Like just sometimes a little trick I learned is just memorize one example, and then from that you can extract a principle. Just think of that one. If all human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. So if you accept the premises, then you have to accept the conclusion. That's a very simple deductive argument. And if the conclusion actually does follow with absolute necessity from the premises, then it's said to be valid. And remember that validity pertains only to deductive arguments. With inductive arguments, you have only highly probable, like 95% probable, which makes it significant in science, or 99%, which is even better, that makes it significant. But it's just probability. High probability, which makes the argument strong. Lower probability makes it weaker. That's why, for example, with the pandemic, they have stages that they go through, and they're using, right now they're experimenting with 5 different vaccines, and they're doing like 300,000 people in order to get a very high probability of the efficacy of the vaccine. So they're using inductive reasoning there. But in generating their hypotheses, sometimes they use deductive reasoning too. With an inductive argument, like I said, an inductive argument claims that its premises give only some degree of probability. And like I said, in science, usually they use 0.95 or 0.99. If it's greater than 0.95, then it's significant. Or even better, 0.99, and then it's significant. That's the other thing is the difference between validity and truth. Oh, my dogs are going crazy. I think you can still hear me though, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll have to put them away. Usually this doesn't happen. Truth has to do with propositions. Arguments, deductive arguments, are either valid or invalid. But they're not true or false. You don't say of an argument that it's a true argument. A proposition is true or false. But an argument is either valid or invalid if it's deductive, or it's highly probable or less probable if it's inductive. So you need to distinguish between truth and validity. That's important. So this chapter is not hard, I don't think. And at the end of each chapter, Copy gives a summary of the chapters. So this one it's important, but it's not hard. It's going to get harder now. I'm not going to try to make it sound like the whole course is going to be easy. It's going to be quite challenging, especially that part on the syllogisms and that big exam we're going to have. But this part is okay. So read chapter 1. Read it in a leisurely way, and usually things stick if you can kind of lessen the anxiety. Okay, so if you have any questions about anything, this is the first time I've ever done this I've been here 34 years at Walsh, and I've never given my telephone number out to people, but in this case, and I want to make it work, and so in order to compensate for not having our discussions and blackboards, and face-to-face discussions, I'm just going to let you call me anytime. And it's fine, just call. I may not pick up right away because I'll be in the backyard training my dogs or walking them or doing something. But I'll get back to you as soon as I can, and I'll clarify everything. So, all right, so I'm going to give it my best. Meet me halfway, we'll make a good course. And I'll get you started in being a good thinker. It's very important to make a good life. Thinking is very important for being human. All right.